Okay, let's get started. This lecture we are going to focus on two-dimensional arrays. So far we have been discussing an array in one dimension. Now if you want to represent data in a table like a tabular format, so we have both rows and columns. So in two-dimensional arrays are representing data in a row column basis, right? So then this lecture will focus on how we can manipulate two-dimensional arrays. Now let's get some idea about the difference between one-dimensional array and the two-dimensional arrays, and also why do we need to have two-dimensional arrays. Okay. Now so far as we have discussed in one-dimensional arrays, so when you are declaring the array, so we are going to specify the data type and the array name and number of elements we want. So once we specify the array, so we will be creating computer memory areas that can store data elements for that particular array. So then this is going to be one row. In that particular row we can store 10 different integers in there, right? So then each of these are going to be 32 bits. So then the whole size is going to be 32 times 10. So that will essentially give us enough space to store 10 integers in one row. So however, suppose we have a situation where we want to represent, let's say, names of students and their exam scores for 3 different exams, and we have a data representation requirement like this, where first array, so we have names, and then we will have 3 different arrays to store those 3 different exams, right? Now in this way, if we have, let's say, so many of these type of collections we need to store, we need to have so many different arrays created. Now if we have a way that we can combine similar data types into one chunk of data and then access it whenever we want it, that would be the best. In that way we can minimize number of independent and individual arrays that we want. Now in here, so first we have names represented in one array. Now names are strings, and then we have exam scores represented as integers in here. So for all 3 exams, values are integers. So therefore they have kind of a common data type. Now if I can put all of these things together into one chunk as a two-dimensional array where we have rows and then columns, so in that way I can use only one variable to represent all of these exam scores. Now here we have names represented as strings, exam scores represented as integers. So we cannot combine strings and integers together into one array. So therefore minimum we need to have 2 different arrays, one representing names, the other one representing exam scores, right? So therefore in general then, for exam 1, so since we have 4 different exam scores that we need to be stored for 4 different students, so then we can have size 4 array, and for exam 2 also size 4 array, exam 3 also size 4 array. Now by combining all 3 of them together, so we can have 3 by 4 array. So that's going to tell us how many rows we have and then how many columns we have. Now in a two-dimensional array, so essentially we have 2 numbers when we represent the size of the array. So first value is giving us how many rows, second array is going to give us how many columns we have in each of these rows. All right. So now then let's look at some programming context here and then see how we can put data into a two-dimensional array and then how we can access data stored in a two-dimensional array. Okay. Now when then first of all declaring let's say a two-dimensional array for our student grade system. So first we need to say how many rows and how many columns are needed. So since we have 4 students and 3 different type of exams, each row is representing each exam, each column is representing individual students. All right. So in general then, when you are declaring a two-dimensional array, first we need to say what data we are going to store in the two-dimensional array, and then the array name and how many columns and how many rows are needed in that particular array that we want, right? So once we declare the array like this, so then we can use array indices to store data in the array as well as retrieve data from the array. Now, unlike one dimensional array, so this time when you are representing a particular element in the array, so we need to recognize that element based on the row as well as a column. All right. So then let's say if this array we call A. Now, the very first element right here, so it's in the first row and the first column. We know that first row has an index 0, first column has an index 0. So therefore, the coordinate of the first element is 0 0. So then I can use the array name A and then 0 0 to represent that particular element. Now, if I want to put a value in there, so I can assign some value into that particular location, right. So therefore, when you are accessing a two-dimensional array, so we basically need to go by the row and the column values to locate each cell in the two-dimensional array. Okay, like in the next one, so we are saying 0 2. So we know that then this is going to be in the first row. So 2 is the third column. So then we are going to put 15 in this element right here. Okay. So likewise, when you want to, let's say, use variables to represent these rows and column numbers, so we can certainly do that. Let's say I is representing row and j is representing column. So if I set I to 1 and then j to 2, this essentially is saying, so I am storing some value in the first row, second row and the third column, right. So therefore, this value will be going in here and then coming into the third column. So then 10 will be stored here. So therefore, when we are accessing two-dimensional arrays, so we can use two variables to represent rows and columns. So with that then, so we can write maybe a nested for loop to read data into two-dimensional array or display data stored in the two-dimensional array. Okay. Now, first of all then, so when you are declaring a two-dimensional array, so how do we initialize the array elements? So when you are initializing, so there are two ways to do that. So we can specify what are the initial values for each row and the column. Now in here, so we are saying I need to have two-dimensional array. So first one is representing the outer for loop, and second one is pretty much representing each row. Now we are basically saying values in the first row are going to be ones and the values in the second row are going to be ones. So then this particular array has 2 rows and then 3 columns. All right. So then 2 rows because we have 2 of these, and the 3 columns because each of these have 3 elements in there. Okay. So therefore, my array pretty much looks like this with 2 rows and then 3 columns in here. Okay. So likewise, I can write a for loop, a nested for loop to accomplish the same thing. So if I want to, let's say, read data from the keyboard and then put them into the two-dimensional array, so I can say that for each row put data into each column. So then outer for loop is essentially representing each row, the row number. Inner for loop is representing each column. Now let's see how we run this for loop. Initially we come here, right, and then we go to the loop control variable. So rows less than 2, so that's true. So therefore, we go inside the loop. Inside the loop we see another loop. So that one starting column value 0 and then goes until column less than 3 and then execute this particular statement. So therefore, internal for loop will be executed 3 times for each row. Now as we run through this one, let's say when the row value is 0, so then column value goes from 0 to 1 to 2. So that essentially means, so my array 0 0 0 1 and then 0 2. So that essentially the values in the first row. So then when we run the for loop, so outer for loop for the first time, so we will be putting data into these cells. So all of these cells belongs to the first row. So likewise, when we increment the row value by 1, so row value will be 1. So for the next time, so then again the column values start from 0 0 1 2. So that essentially saying my array 1 0 1 1 1 2. That means the second row, first element, second row, second element, second row, third element, and so on and so forth, right? So then using a nested for loop, so we can read data into a two-dimensional array. Okay. All right. So let's do some practice questions, and then see if we can write this thing together. So suppose we want to declare a two-dimensional array for a student to score the quiz scores, homework scores, and the test scores, right? So there are 4 quizzes, 4 homeworks, and 4 tests. So we call this array student score. Now in this one then, so since we have 3 different type of things that we want to store, each of these 3 things are going to have 4 of them. So then it's essentially going to be something along this line, where we have 3 rows and then 4 columns. So first row can represent the quiz, second row can represent the homework, third row can represent the test. All right. So then this is going to be the quiz, so this is going to be the homework, so this is going to be the test score, right? So then since we are having 4 of each of these, so then we have 4 cells to represent quiz, homework, and test scores, right? So suppose we are going to store double values in here, so therefore this array is going to be a double array, and then we are going to call it student score, right? So then this is going to have 3 rows to represent quiz, homework, and test scores, and then 4 columns to represent 4 of each of these 0 scores. All right. So that will essentially create something like this with a two-dimensional array of 3 rows and then 4 columns. All right. Next, suppose we want to initialize all the elements to 0 using a loop. Once we declare it, then so we can write a nested for loop. So we can say for each int, I'm going to use actually the row. So row start from 0, that's the first row, and then row less than 3, we have 3 rows, 0, 1, 2, and then row plus plus. So inside this, so we need to initialize each column now for the row. Okay. So then we have for int column. So column start from 0, and then column should be less than 4 because we have 4 columns, and then column plus plus. Okay. So now inside this, so we are going to initialize all the values to 0. So therefore it should be student score. So row column going to be 0, right? So that essentially going to initialize all the values of this array to 0. Okay. So next then, suppose I want to do the same thing without writing a loop, but I need to initialize all the elements to 0 while declaring it. So now in order for us to do that, so what you can do is actually we can do something like this. So double student score, so 3 rows and then 4 columns. So this will be equals to, and then I need to represent each column. So since we have 4 columns and 3 rows, so then these ones are going to be representing each row. So this is row 1, row 2, and then row 3, right? So since this array representation in here, so since this one is empty, so that empty essentially means that we will be initializing all the elements to 0. Now how do we know that we have 4 columns? We know we have 4 columns because of this. Okay. Now if you don't want to specify the size there, so we can actually do it in another way. We can declare the same thing. So double student score. This time we are not going to give the size, but this time we can actually specify how many values are going to be there in each row. So something like this, right? So 0. Right. So that's pretty much going to allocate an array of 3 rows because of this, and then 4 columns because there are 4 values in here. So each of these values will be initialized to 0. Okay. So then there are many ways of initializing the content of a 2-dimensional array. So when we declare it, either we can first declare it and then write a for loop to do that, or we can initialize it while declaring it. Okay. Now suppose we want to use that array to perform some computations there. So let's say that the first row is going to have exam scores, and if I want to write a for loop to read test scores for the first row of the loop, so even though it's a 2-dimensional array, I can actually perform operations column wise as well as a row wise. Now this time this is what I want. So I have this 2-dimensional array with 3 rows and the first 4 columns, and now I need to read data into this one only. So that's the exam scores. So then that will pretty much act like is 1-dimensional array. So for this one, so for all the elements, so row number will be 0, column number will be changing from 0 to 3, right? So then we can write a for loop for that. So you can say for int column equals 0, column less than 4, column plus plus. So we can say cin student score 0. So that's pretty much representing the row that we are reading data into, and then the column number is the only one that will be changing, right? So then that allows us to read data into the first row. Okay. So likewise, if I want to read data into the second row where the homework scores are stored, so then we can pretty much do the same thing. So in this case then, so the row value will be 1. So column values are the ones that are changing then. So similar for loop. So then for int column equals 0, column less than 4, column plus plus, cin student score. Right. So this time it's going to be row 1, and then column value is the one that will be changing. So that allows us to read data into the second row, so that has the homework scores, right? And then if the third row consists of quiz scores, so we can write a similar for loop for that. The only difference would be, so the row number for this one would be 2, and then the same for loop would work. All right. Now once we have, let's say, read all the data items into that 2-dimensional array, now if I just want to display what the student scores are, so then I can again write a nested for loop. So here I can say row goes from 0 to 2, so then 0, 1, 2, so all 3 rows, and then for each of these rows columns go from 0 to 3, so those 4 values, and see out student score row column, right? So that essentially is going to display student scores for each of these items like the homework, quizzes and the tests in each row at a time, right? So for the first iteration of the outer for loop, so then we will be displaying the exam scores, so that's the first row. So for the second row we will be displaying homework scores. For the third row we will be displaying quiz scores for all the students, right? So then in this way, so we can read data into a 2-dimensional array using a for loop or a nested for loop, or we can get data stored in a 2-dimensional array using a for loop or a nested for loop. Okay, and also we can do row and column wise operations. Now when you are doing row column operations, so let's say for this particular array, so 3 rows and then 4 columns, if I want to do row operations, so we can use the row number as a fixed value and the column number will be the one changing, right? So then 0, 1 and 2 here. Okay, now if I want to use the column values, so then column value will be the one that is fixed and the row value will be changing. Now if I want to perform, let's say, the exam score, quiz score and the homework score for one particular students, so then I need to go for each column, right? So then I can use the column number as a fixed one, 0, and the row number is the one that will be changing. All right. So then that structure would be something like this for row equals 0. So row less than 3, row plus plus. So then C out student score. So this time we have the row number and the column number is 0, right. So in that way we can pretty much use the column value as the fixed value, right. So therefore in two-dimensional arrays, so not only nested for loops to perform all row column based operation, but also we can use single for loop to perform row based as well as a column based operations. Okay.